Continuing with the construction of the forward superstructure, I need to make modifications to parts A8 and A10. These outcroppings on the exterior lower portion of these components needs to be cut out and removed. The hole that I then open up will then need to be filled to create a smooth vertical bulkhead. While I'm working in this area, I'll also put together this small rectangular structure that goes in the center of the deck. This is only being done because it's going to need to be installed before I install the next level of the superstructure. Obviously, while I'm working in this area of the ship, I might as well do all these components since they are related to each other. In the planning video, I had cut all these components off of the sprue to do a dry fit. If you want to have more insight into my planning process for this area of the ship, go take a look at video 28 in this build series. Since I had previously cut them off the sprue, all that I need to do at this stage is to clean up the excess plastic. I do this by clipping off the excess and then filing the edges to create a reasonably smooth finish. They don't need to be perfectly finished at this point because they are going to be glued together and then the seam lines are going to be filled, so there will be further filing and sanding in their future. I just want to clean them up a little bit at this stage to make my life a little bit easier further down the road. After the parts are cleaned up, they can be glued together. I glue the parts together using Trumpeter extra thin plastic cement. To glue them together, I place them in contact with each other and then apply the glue to the seam line. Small components like this that fit together quite well once properly prepared are very easy to assemble. On these parts where I'm going to be cutting out these outcroppings, the reason why I glued them together was just to make them a little bit bigger, to make them easier to handle. If you so choose, you could make this modification before gluing the parts together. But I do think that gluing them together will, in addition to make it easier to handle, also provide just a little bit more structural integrity. Now that the glue has dried, I can cut out these outcroppings. When cutting out the outcroppings, be careful not to distress the plastic that you want to retain. Taking big cuts deep into plastic will force the plastic to move away from the blade. If you don't want to distress the plastic that you want to retain, you need to provide a gap for the plastic to move into. That is why I start by cutting out a large gap in the center of the component away from the edges that I want to retain, so that when I move on to making smaller cuts near the boundaries, there is a place for the plastic to move into. This will then prevent the plastic that I want to retain from becoming distressed. I'm trying to keep this gap as rectangular as possible, so that a single piece of styrene strip can be inserted into this gap to fill it. Once the outcroppings have been fully cut out, and then find an appropriate sized styrene strip. Since I want to try and do this with one piece of styrene, I figured the best way to go about it would be to glue it on one side first, let that glue properly set, and then just bend it around that curve. This should then allow me to avoid quite a lot of sanding because I already have that smooth curve on that corner. I won't need to create it by sanding. To glue down this first side of the styrene strip, I'm using Trumpeter extra thin plastic cement. I then repeat the process on the mirror image component. Once the glue is dry, I can then get to bending and shaping it. I use pliers to hold the styrene strip on the edge where I want to bend, and then simply bend it around the corner. And at this point, I'm very chuffed with myself. I think I've done something that's very clever here, and it's all going so well. I should have known that it was going to go wrong. But at this point, I'm still oblivious, so I happily cut it to the correct length, use the pliers to do a test fit, and everything is looking perfect. I'm thinking to myself, this is going to go so easily. So I apply extra thin plastic cement to the contact area and the styrene strip promptly cracks in half. Which, now that I think about it, makes perfect sense because the extra thin plastic cement somewhat melts the plastic together, which is another way of saying that when you apply plastic cement to styrene, it weakens it. And that is exactly what happened. I weakened the plastic couldn't handle that tighter bend, so it snapped. So much for that. Of course, because I like to make things difficult for myself, I then repeated the exact same process with the exact same outcome on the mirror image component. What I should have done is used extra thin super glue to glue it in place. Since there is now a crack on this corner, I do need to go about filling it and preparing it so that I can sand it. In an area like this where I do need some structural integrity, I'm going to fill it using superglue rather than plastic putty. This is definitely a case where superglue will be the superior choice. Since I'm going to need to cut through some of the styrene sheet, I do need to have quite a lot of superglue backing it, so I fill the area with a lot of extra thick superglue. While I'm at it, I also fill the gaps around the patch on the outside of the component. I repeat this process on the mirror image component as well. Since there is a lot of extra thick superglue on these components, it will take a long time to dry. In this case, I left it for around a day to dry. I want that glue to be rock hard. And I don't want to use superglue accelerate to make it dry more quickly, because if you do that, it can create little bubbles inside the glue, and then you're going to have a rough finish. I obviously want the finish to be perfectly smooth. So no accelerator, just let it dry naturally. It will just take some time. Once the glue is dry, I can then move on to the sanding phase. Fortunately, in this case, there's also not a lot of detail around this area of the component. There's only one wriggle and one plastic ridge that I need to maintain. Those can just be covered up with a piece of masking tape, and they'll be sufficiently protected. Starting with the file, I work off the excess, and then once sufficiently smoothed, I move on to 500 grit sandpaper to get a much smoother finish. After the difficulty that I put myself through in the previous video with superglue filler, I decided to fill the gaps, this time using Tamiya plastic putty. I apply the plastic putty to the part using a toothpick. Only a very thin layer is required. After all, it will be almost entirely sanded off, with only the putty that is in the actual gaps being retained. One advantage of plastic putty is that it is white, which means it's much easier to see once you've sanded through the putty and are sanding the plastic. With the superglue being clear, it's difficult to see if you've taken off too little, or even worse, too much. After giving the putty around an hour to dry, you can then sand it off. Sand it off using 400 grit sandpaper. Now to check my work and see if any visible defects are present on the components, I spray them in Mr. Surfacer 500, and I do find some minor defects that I then correct with further rounds of sanding with 400 grit sandpaper. And that is it for these components. That went surprisingly well. I only made one mistake, and it was relatively easy to correct, so that was good. And I think I prefer the putty. I think I'm going to go back to using putty more for filling. Superglue is too difficult to remove. Plastic putty, I suppose, is what it's designed for, so it makes sense that it works well for this. It's just if you have to put a lot of it on, or if you're trying to make it fit in some kind of a place where it needs to have structural integrity, then superglue is better to use. In the next video, I'm going to be moving back down to the lower portion of the superstructure, where I'm going to be making modifications to the bulkheads that run along the top of the shelter deck. If you would like to support this channel or see how the ship looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.